Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Joe Reed, writing as Parker Adams, about the Lockbox. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's so good to be here.
Thank you. It's great to have you as a guest. I appreciate you saying yes. So give us a little overview about what the Lockbox is.
Sure. The Lockbox is a heist story. It's set in Los Angeles at the very start of COVID, those first couple of months where everybody was running around with masks and no one sort of knew what was going on. And LA's finest safecracker is a woman named Monna Locke, and she's doing her business and she gets kidnapped by a bunch of bad people. And they want to force her to participate in what could be the heist of the century. And that's the story.
It is. So it's a thriller, and I sort of hesitate to say this because some thriller authors don't like this. I find it has a bit of a slow burn, but it's a very continual burn that kept me very engrossed in it. And I liked that. I mean, I like heist scenes and I like running and jumping and all that stuff, but I also like something that I can get all the way into. And I think that's what you've given us.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really sweet. The pacing on this book compared to my first series, which was an air marshal and it's sort of high stakes aviation stuff, that this was a slower, more consistent burn, and pacing the character beats and stuff like that was more of a challenge. That was one of the fun parts of the book. But yeah, I'm glad that worked well.
It did for me. It did a lot, and I really did enjoy it because I think sometimes with a slower burn, we get to ride along with the main characters. We get to sort of be in their pocket or on their shoulder for the whole journey. And I enjoyed that a lot. So when did you start the book?
I started this one during sort of the COVID lockdowns. I was coming off Walker number 3. And those are all about airports and airplanes and stuff like that. And so we're sitting at home and we're locked down, and I'm racking my brain about how am I going to write another air marshal book, in the middle of, everybody sitting at home.
Yeah, the air marshal doesn't work very much if the plane is empty.
Exactly. And stuck on the ground. Pardon me. So, I was a big heist movie fan, always have been. And so I'm watching the TV and I'm watching the empty freeways and folks running around with masks. And in seeing all that, it struck me that it would be a really great time to pull off, try to pull off a really big crime. And so I was like, well, let me do something different. Let me try something different. And so that's how the book came about. So I started maybe 6 months into the pandemic, and it took me a while to write. It took me a while to find Monna's voice and all that stuff. And obviously the publishing world had kind of slowed down during the pandemic too. So that's why this just came out in March. But it's a happy little book. I'm really pleased with the way it's done and the way it turned out. But it's always good to hear that folks like you liked it. So,
well, and when the pandemic started, I really sort of began to think about what would happen with writing. As you say, because it's so evident in the book, the freeways are empty and everyone has a mask on. We're supposed to be sheltered in place. So I began to worry that everything would become about that. And I'm so happy to say that my worries were unfounded. And in yours, I thought what you did was it was so delicate in the way that you showed us where we had been. You presented it to us, but yet we didn't drown in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I was very worried about that. There was a big conversation among all my writer friends during the pandemic of what should we do? Should we write the pandemic into the books? Should we write books pre-pandemic and pretend it never happened? Should we write books post-pandemic and like, oh, we're past it and just forget about it because readers won't want to pay attention to it? I got a lot of criticism and I got a lot of worries from my friends of like, oh, geez, Joe, setting a book during COVID is not a great move. Um, but I tried to make it more a setting than anything else. And I did try to capitalize a little bit on the anxiety of the moment and the uncertainty of the moment. I think that comes through in the book. Meg Gardner was asking me about that at my event with her. Um, but yeah, not having it be overwhelming. It's not a book about COVID. It's just a book set during COVID.
And I think that, so for me, as I said, it reminded me of all the things that some of us enjoyed. I mean, there were days where being on the freeway here in Los Angeles, it was like, oh my gosh, this is what it should be like every day. But then,
Yeah,
when you have, having friends suffer from it, you realize that you don't really want it to be this every day because you don't want your friends to suffer. But yet at the same
sure.
time, there was a bit of what I might call empty air in our busy days and our busy lives. We run to and fro. We go to the grocery store, we go to work, we're on the freeways, and that sucks up a lot of air. But during parts of the pandemic, there was what I call empty air, which I think you found that in I found that in reading your book, that it was the things that weren't there. I know there's a place that Monna says that she wouldn't be afraid of being at this big mansion, except there was simply no one there. And it wasn't that
Yeah.
there just weren't people there. It was there was no one anywhere around anywhere. And I do think that that's a flavor of something that we got during the pandemic that you brought up so well in your book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the book starts with her being called out to this mansion in Malibu, and it's sort of a routine job for her, right? It's go in, open up this safe, and get a box out because the owners, sort of living off in Montana or something like that. But yeah, it's creepy, and I remember having those moments, and I'm sure you do too, where you were used to a certain amount of human contact, and suddenly you're in all these settings where it almost feels like a zombie movie, where you're like, am I the only person left in the world, right? And it does affect you, I think. And I think the reverse now. I was just at Comic-Con, and I know you and I've been at conferences together. I think the reverse is true now, right? You're in crowds and you're like, oh my God, I didn't notice
Precise.
the crowd before, but now it's weird. And so it definitely warped our perceptions, I think, of both being alone and being with a lot of people.
I totally agree. So I noticed one thing that you do. This is all about complimenting Joe Reed on his writing, because
Thank you.
so this is a
Thank you.
love fest for me. This is very easy
Thank
for
you.
me. So sometimes I've brought this up on the podcast more than one time. If you tell me the sky is blue, I assume it's blue, but I don't need 87 descriptions of the shade of blue it is. But what I
Yeah.
find is you're so incredibly visual. It's almost a little bit frightening. And I mean that as a compliment. So when Mana is in this mansion at the beginning of the book, we see
Yeah.
everything in the room. And then later, there are chase scenes that last chapters with you, Joe. I'm like, Jeepers
Yeah.
Creepers. But it keeps the boil going, it keeps you invested. Um,
Good.
how how hard or how easy are writing those
Yeah.
descriptions and keeping them in line?
I mean, it's fun. It gives you, it's part of the fun of the book and plotting it out. I worry sometimes because I know I'm overly detailed, and I don't want people to pause or to skip over stuff, or be like, oh, why is he telling me what this room looks like? Generally, if I have a description like that, it's because I know it's going to pay off later, and I'm trying to do it as a setup so that you have a better sense of place, because um, it may seem like the room is innocuous now. Why is he bothering telling me this? But she's going to run through that room in 3 chapters, and I want you to kind of have a sense of what it looks like when she does it. So I think a lot of my description is more setup for the action pieces than anything else. And so I'm glad it works. Hopefully it wasn't too much, but yeah, I do. I see the books like as movies in my head. when I'm plotting them out and when I'm writing, and that very much I think translates to my style for all my books, that they're very visual, and that's just kind of what you're stuck with me.
Well, I'm willing to be stuck with you. How's that? So,
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
so that was something that. So I do know because I've read your bio. So you started
Yeah.
out as a marine biologist, and
Yes,
then
sir.
went on to being a patent attorney, and now an
Yep.
author. So
Yep.
how does one make the transition from a little boy growing up to being a marine
Yeah.
biologist, which I think a lot of people think, oh, that must be a fantastic job. I don't know whether it is or not. And then on to being an
Yeah.
attorney. So give us a little idea of what it was like for Joe to move through these phases of his life.
Yeah. I honestly, I never thought about being a lawyer or anything like that when I was growing up. I was always going to be a research scientist. My dad was in the Navy, and we moved around a lot. Um, I was jumping from school to school, and when you leave a school, the kids are usually nice enough to give you a couple of gifts on the way out. And so one of the gifts I got was a little book on sharks, and I fell in love with them, and I thought it was the greatest thing ever. And so I was one of those kids. Some kids are this way with dinosaurs or space. I was this way with
Mhm,
sharks, where it was
mhm.
I watched every National Geographic show, and I went dragged my parents to every aquarium and all that stuff. Um, to the point where, like, I went to college, and my professors laughed at me that they would throw random shark jokes into the lectures because they knew I was there. Um, and that was always the plan. And I went and started grad school, and had every intention of really being a scientist. But when I got there, what I discovered was two things. Number one, um, doing science is about a lot more than actually the science. There's a lot of grant writing, a lot of politics, and a lot of things that I didn't enjoy very much every day. And then there's just not many jobs, or at least there weren't back in those days. And so it was a kind of mercenary decision of, I need to feed my family, and how am I going to do that? And I'd always joked around like, well, if it all goes to heck, I'll just be a lawyer. And I was always a decent writer. I was the kind of guy that in my lab people brought me their articles to edit and stuff like that, and I'd taken a bunch of writing classes and stuff. Um, and so when you make the list on your pad of like, what should I do next? Right, what am I good at? Writing was one of those things. And so I looked around, I was like, okay, well, lawyers write a lot. I can do that. So I went to law school, and with a science background, sort of getting into patent law and high tech law was a natural fit, and that just sort of happened naturally. But in the background this whole time, I wasn't thinking about being a writer. I was just a fan. I was one of those people. I'm old enough that, like, I'm pre-Kindle, and so I would go on vacation and I'd shove 7 or 10 paperbacks in my suitcase, kind of thing.
Right.
And so my wife and I were on a trip before my first daughter was born, and I'm reading Rules of Prey by John Sanford, and it just grabbed me, and my friends had warned me it was going to grab me. And I'd always considered myself a pretty good writer, but I'm reading this book, and I'm thinking to myself, these writers, these fiction writers, are like, you know, the Olympic athletes of writing, right? Like they are the Simone Biles, or whatever you want to say, of writing. I wonder if I could do this. I wonder if I could write like this. And so I had a little idea, and I went home, and I started writing it, and it was horrible, and I was horrible. And so I banged my head against the desk for about 6 months. And then I went to the library and got books on writing and started trying to figure out how to do it. Um, 3 books later, two sitting in a drawer, I got my deal, and that was for Takeoff, which was my first book that came out in 18. And we've gone. The Lockbox is book number 4. So I've been lucky enough to have some success, and be able to keep going with it. But that's that's kind of how it came about. It was good fortune. It was being a fan. It was just being in awe and really appreciating what these fabulous authors do, because they're capable of amazing stuff. I'm messing around, and hopefully I do some things that are entertaining, but I'm just trying to fit in with the greats, that are around me.
Anytime I hear someone say, Dan, I don't really read very much, I think to myself, we are so blessed in today's world that I don't think there's anything that you could want to read that isn't available in some form or another.
That's
And
right.
we are so blessed with so many incredibly talented authors who bring sometimes the same character through 20 books, or they bring a different character for each book. But there cannot be anything that someone can't read. I mean, no matter whether you like space opera or you like murder and mystery and thriller or a rom-com, there is something, if you can read, if you are able to read, there's something out there for you. You just have to look for
Absolutely.
it. And we are
Absolutely.
fortunate because we do. And I am, even though I would say I started out with a few more rom-coms, but I'm a huge fan of mystery and thrillers and murders. And, that's the way so some authors say that's the way they get their catharsis. I come home and read about somebody being killed and I think, oh, they're my coworkers. Which is probably
Yep.
not a nice thing
Yep.
to say about my coworkers, but anyway, darn it. So you did something also with this book. You gave Monna a son who tags
Yes.
along, for lack of a better way to put it, tags along. How was that in your writing experience, giving Monna a child that's in
Yeah.
peril just as she is? How was that for you as a father and as an author?
Yeah, it was hard. It was rewarding. It was all those things. Yeah, I have two kids. They're older now. They're my younger one's 14, my older one's 19. So Evan in the book is about 5. And so I lived through, those stages, and I know what those stages are like. Um, I wanted Monna to be grounded. I wanted Monna to have, a lot at stake in this book. Um, and it's one thing, I think, when you're in peril. It's another thing when someone you love is in peril, and it doesn't have to be a child, but this was sort of the natural fit for her because of some of her backstory, and it gets at who she is and why she is the way she is. Um, but he was good. He was a little bit of comic relief, hopefully here and there, as kids tend to be, even in the darkest
Mm-hmm.
moments.
Mm-hmm.
But he also, I think, elevates the stakes and hopefully makes it a little more urgent for her to try and escape from these people who've kidnapped them and are using him essentially to force her to do this.
And I think you get to see in your writing, you get to see that children see things that adults don't see. I think we adults
Mm-hmm.
have a responsibility with children, to show them right and wrong and all, but we also have a great lesson to learn from children because they see things so much simpler than we do. We have all these backstories about every person we meet. We have a backstory. Children meet these characters or people where they are, and I thought you did a great job with that. I enjoyed that part of him.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. That's great.
So, do you have a website or social media you'd like to share with the audience?
Sure. Yeah. My website is Joseph Reid Books, REID Books.com. And my handle on social media is the same thing. It's Joseph Reid Books. So I'm on Instagram and I'm on Facebook and all those sites. People sometimes get confused with the pen name because I'm Parker Adams for this book, but I've linked everything over. So if you accidentally go to ParkerAdamsBooks.com, for example, it links over to Joseph Reid Books. So
Fantastic. Again, the book is called The Lockbox. It's by Joe Reid and Parker Adams, one and the same person. Thank you so much for joining me, Joe. I had such a great time.
no, thank you so much for having me, Dan. I know we've been trying to schedule this for a long time, but it was such a pleasure meeting you at conferences and stuff. And I'm so glad we got to talk.
So am I.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at outwithdan.com, on Twitter at outwithdan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.